So, I knew this video was going to be part of this year, because you cannot do a year of leadership without looking at one of the most famous examples of leadership absolutely mucking up. You just can't. But I wasn't sure when it was going to be. Honestly, wasn't sure. Because, what's the Jeune Ecole? It's looking at why Hoche comes to be, why they have these battle hotels. And the thing is, it is such a response to a uniquely French dilemma, but also such a product of a uniquely French situation, it would seem on the outside. But when you get close to it, you look at it and go, hang on, there are a lot of parables with other people these days. With other technologies, with things that have happened since then and are happening even now. You see, this is a period when leadership, to an extent, abandons its duties to the political contest between technologies. You see, one of the abiding constants of war has been combined arms warfare. I know we like to think it's a new thing, but it's really not. Okay, it's really, really not. You have, for a long period of time, whenever you've been fighting major battles, or you're talking about multiple units. Whilst the individual skirmishes might between, let's put it, archers and cavalrymen. In a battle, you would have ranged units, you would have infantry, you would have cavalry, you would have artillery. You would bring the full combined arms force. That has been a constant. And the reality is, whilst min-maxing works so well in a computer game, it really does work in a computer game. And I'm currently doing a UAD stream on Twitch every Sunday morning, where I am min-maxing my force. I'm building a whole load of destroyers, hundreds of them, and I'm building many battleships, and I'm not building cruisers. Pretty much. I've got a few knocking around, but they're really a small, almost afterthought. The reality is, that works in a computer game. That doesn't work in a fleet structure in real life, because A, cost, B, the reality of having to be present around the world of doing deterrence and conflict management and relationship management requires you to have a cruiser-sized vessel for doing all those missions. That's one of the reasons why most escorts these days are cruiser-sized. But also, and the other added complication once you're dealing with real life is, on a computer game, everything works. It works. And it's an even playing field. Real life is very rarely an even playing field. In fact, if you're fighting a fair battle, why the frigate are you fighting that battle? Why are you allowing your opponent to have a fair fight? There is nothing good for any power to be involved in a fair fight, whether you are the smaller power or the bigger power involved in that fight, or if you're both same size. You don't want to be involved in a fair fight. The whole point of operations and the operational art is to try and arrange it so you're not in a fair fight. Now, the Jeune Ecole, well, I'm going to start by explaining what the Jeune Ecole is and giving a little bit of a quick introduction to what I've already done in another video. I've done another video, which a link will go up to above my head a while ago, called the Jeune Ecole in 30 minutes or less, but I'm going to quickly go through it. But please note, if you want to hear more about the Jeune Ecole and what it was, please go to that video. If you search Jeune Ecole, you will find a lot of discussion of it, because it comes up regularly, because arguably the Jeune Ecole was the beginning of a phase when people go, this new technology means everything else is irrelevant and gone. That's the cycle. And it's so attractive. It's wonderful. Think about it. You have solved all the problems by going for a new technology. There are many, many issues with the Jeune Ecole, but we'll leave that to one side and we'll get into discussion. So, it starts off with Henry Joseph Paxins, and mainly he's focusing on rapid-fire artillery, on rapid-fire shells, and how explosive and dangerous they are. They mean smaller ships can destroy bigger ships, you know? And he starts this off roughly in the 1860s. And it starts a wonderful debate, because when you are a power who seemingly cannot win, like France, and France is in a strategically terrible position, a strategically advantageous position for most of its period, because it's unified and the countries around it aren't. The moment you start having Germany unified, Italy unified, Spain actually coherently unified, the moment you have these sort of scenarios going on around it, France starts to have problems. You see, France is powerful as long as they are the large unified country in Europe, and everyone else is smaller states that they can play off against each other and they can send large armies in to fight. That's when France goes rocking. That's Napoleonic Wars. That's pretty much how I'll look through that history, and you'll go, oh yeah, it's the German states, not Germany. There's Prussia. There's all sorts of different states within Germany at this point, and all these things. That's when that can happen. Unfortunately, through the 19th century, the world starts to change. All those states starts to unify, and suddenly France has a problem. Maintaining an army sufficient enough to protect its massive borders and be able to deter threats to it, and maintaining a navy sufficient enough for its status in the world. Because you can't be a world power and have the status of a world power and maintain an empire without a navy. Whereas Britain, island nation, can afford to just go, how much money for the navy again? Okay, yeah. The army needs some? Really? What do they want? New uniforms? There's a reason why the Boer War happens, okay? We'll just leave that there. That's a whole other kettle of fish. We're talking about the Jeune Ecole today. So, this is something which is very attractive, because the idea is, well, with small ships with these rapid-firing shell guns, they can destroy big ships, so we don't need the big ships. We can save money. Now, the problem is with that is automatically everyone else can have access to the same technology you can. This is ultimately always the problem. Someone else can do exactly the same thing. There's also the problem that, well, big ships might carry big price tags, and small ships might carry smaller price tags, but a force which is composed of a mixture of big ships with bigger guns and ultimately possibly longer ranges and probably maybe more stability, so more accuracy of firing, plus the smaller ships, will probably win against a force which is just made of the smaller ships. The thing is, what happens is the exact reverse of what you need in this scenario. Whilst you do want admirals to get involved, you do want naval officers and people to get involved, and there's a massive journalist who's pushing this in France and pushing these technologies. Whilst you do want these people to get involved, what you want them to do is to get involved in a way that they are promoting the new technology, but not immediately going, we should get rid of everything. Now, we would often argue that when you have Admiral Hyacinthe Laurent Theophile Aube reach French Minister of Marine and basically pause battleship construction for almost the entire time he was in office, it reaches its peak. I'm not so sure. Because it causes a lot more disruption than this. You see, the thing is, you pretty much have a debate going on almost from 1860 onwards as whether or not battleships, larger ships, even cruisers, although they are part of the Jeune Ecole, because the idea was that you would have small flotilla forces defending your coast, and which would annihilate enemy battle fleets should they attack you or try to impose a blockade, whilst your cruisers go out destroying the enemy's commerce. I always think it's the first thing it ignores is what happens if your enemy turns up with their own flotillas as well as their big ships. That's the first problem, I'd say, with that idea, but we'll leave that to one side. We won't get into this too much. The Jeune Ecole, I spent I spent roughly 30 minutes picking it apart. I don't need to do that again. But no, he is the most active participant and active supporter, and he kind of this doctrine, of this idea. And there's a problem there, because the first rule, usually when you're a senior officer in the armed forces and you're looking at procurement, is yes, something might be the future, but is it the now? And are you going to bet the entire country on it? Because if you get this wrong, you could lose the war and your entire country could be destroyed. So the normal thing is, okay, this might be the future, we're going to invest in it. But to make sure, we're going to cover ourselves by investing in what is the existing capabilities now as well, so to keep them viable for as long as possible. That's sensible, because yeah, this might be the future. This might be the future. In 10 years' time, this might be the way of war. But if war happens in 6 years' time, and by that point that's not ready, and you lose the war because of that, then you're never getting that 10-year point. And that's if it's 10 years. I've seen arguments recently that the Houthis, with their actions in the Red Sea, have finally vindicated the Jeune Ecole. I wouldn't agree with that under any circumstances, but that's a whole different discussion. And that would mean it was 165 years early they were making the case. 165 years. But finally, Jeune Ecole's been vindicated by the Houthis. Really? They've disrupted things, certainly, but I don't think they've annihilated any battle fleets. I don't think they've won any wars. They've caused trouble. Some archaeologists, what's going on with shipping, has discussed exactly how much trouble they have, and I'm in no illusions that it is a great deal of trouble. But I don't think they've vindicated the Jeune Ecole as a doctrine. I really don't. I saw that article and went, oh my lord, that's a stretch. The trouble is, the problem with the rapid-fire guns is that, as said, the big ships could also carry rapid-fire guns, and you could carry armour, and HMS Warrior comes about, and a few other ships start to come about, and suddenly they have protection against some of the damage of the shells, and you can put that more easily on a bigger ship, because a bigger ship can more easily take the displacement load of having the armour, whether it's iron or Harvey or whatever grade armour you put into it eventually. And you also start putting rapid firing guns. Okay, well no, okay, so we're right. It's not guns, it's torpedoes. It's torpedoes now comes up as the option. And torpedoes, it's first of all, it's going to be spar torpedoes, which you're going to ram into a ship, and then they realise that's not really a good idea. Then the whitehead torpedo comes along. Woohoo, we're saved. It's the whitehead torpedo. It's going to make a hole in the ship that's going to sink it. And the thing you might be thinking of is, Alex, hang on. Yeah, torpedoes are powerful, but they haven't made fleets not work. You're right. You'd be very right. But one of the things is that the torpedo and the Jeune Ecole arguably pushes down the development of submarine forces. It pushes the development of destroyer forces, well, torpedo boat forces, which then become torpedo boat destroyers and later on destroyers, etc. All these things. And that's useful. But the more interesting thing to me is the fact that the Jeune Ecole, it's almost like the French are trying to focus in on one part of the fleet, so they don't have to pay for the other part. They're not treating it as an all or nothing. They're not treating it as, okay, yes, we've got to do this. Because the other problem they have is they are a global empire. They do have to be present around the world, and it's an issue. You can't necessarily do that with submarines. You can't necessarily do that with torpedo boats. And you can try and use the cruisers for all that, but if the cruiser's on its own and comes across an enemy battleship, in a scenario where it can't get away, it's in trouble. It really is in trouble. But they keep on pushing forward because it's an offset strategy in some ways. It's an interesting idea of an offset strategy because if we consider most other more modern offset strategies, again, become very much the buzzword focus of their time, whether that's drones, stealth, whatever it is, it's an offset strategy. But since the Jeune Ecole, no one's ever really seriously tried to market, okay, now everything should be this. I realise everyone's trying to say that all aircraft should be stealth, and then you go, well, hang on, transport aircraft aren't going to be stealth, are they? Well, no, they won't. But all aircraft but transport aircraft, and then so tanker aircraft aren't going to be stealth, are they? Well, probably not. And what about AWACS? Well, of course, with the providing the data response, there's not much point in them being stealth either. And yeah, then we got, and you start working through the list, and you go, okay, so what we need is stealth aircraft for what part of the war? Usually the opening phase, and it's useful for the opening phase of the conflict. It's about causing the critical amount of the maximum critical damage in the shortest critical time at the beginning of a conflict, so you put the enemy on as far as you can on the back foot, so you can then dictate the pace and the flow of the conflict, so you can win the war on your terms. That's where stealth comes an advantage. It's not usually going to be as much of a assistance to operations on day 90. Because though at that point you've either degraded the enemy's air defence to the point at which that they're not much threat to your aircraft anyway, or you're in a very, very high-tech version of World War I, attrition warfare, in which case they probably have a system which is countering your stealth aircraft anyway. That's the joy of the world. And they even built the Dupuy de l'Homme and other vessels. They build these ships, and the whole idea, I said, was always that the smaller flotillas would destroy the enemy battle fleet and allow the cruisers to go wandering around the world. And it sounds so good on paper. It really does, because it sounds like we can save money. We can save money, we can do what we want, we can do all this. And it's so scientifically perfect, and it's, as said, it's so French. Because the French have a long history of going for the mathematically perfect, the scientifically perfect. That's not necessarily a bad thing. They went for it in their Age of Sail ship designs, and they produced some of the finest hulls the world would see in that period. And then the Royal Navy, when they captured them, would tend to alter them, because whilst they were the perfect ships for speed and sailing, the problem was the practicalities of long-range operations dictated that you needed a ship that would survive. Maybe it gets there faster, in terms of the French ship, but does it get there with the crew in a condition in which they can fight? It gets there faster, but the action movement of the ship tends to unsettle the crew enough that once they've crossed the Atlantic or something like that, they're going to need a couple of days. Whereas for the Royal Navy, they wanted the ship to be able to get there. Maybe it takes a day or so longer to get to the destination, but it's capable of fighting the moment it gets there. Its crew are not in that bad a condition. And the reason is because the French design their ships to sail perfectly and as close to the line as physically possible, so they can eke out every bit of wind. And if you've ever seen the speed sailing boats when they're doing those yacht races and the moves the crews are going through, it's not quite that extreme we're talking about. But you look at those moves and you look at the crew when they get off them afterwards, and you go, okay, you're not exactly in condition that I'd want to do anything else with you now. I don't think you should be going into any kind of barroom brawl. You don't look to be in that good a condition for that. And that's That's the reality of what we're talking about. You can design something with a perfect idea in mind, but the practicality can get you. And the perfection of this engineering of the Jeune Ecole, the problem comes because it's as long as the enemy doesn't respond, this works. As long as the enemy falls into your trap. As long as the British come bumbling up with their battle fleet to your harbours, into your flotillas, without thinking about anything that can stop it. That's always the problem with these solutions. They presume the other side is dumb. They presume the other side is just going to do what you want to do. Now, sometimes nations do that, and often nations which fall most prey to this are the nations which are in a strategic situation where they can't afford to not hope for that case. And you can argue the French, like Japan in the late 1930s, are both in a trap where they cannot afford for their opponent to do anything but fall into the trap they're designing for them. The Japanese trap is also kind of like the Jeune Ecole. Remember, the whole idea was to get the Americans or the British to charge their fleet up, be attrited until they were level. The Japanese could close in and annihilate them. That was the Japanese plan. And to do that, you have to make your opponent angry enough that they're not going to turn back when they're looking at their force numbers. They're going to keep going on. They're going to disregard losses. They're going to disregard all sense. They're going to charge on. And you sit there and go, that's not really a likelihood when we're dealing with the US Navy and the Royal Navy in the 1930s. Both of them are highly professional forces, and if they start to look at their numbers and go, I've lost a lot of destroyers, or, a lot of my picket ships have been picked off by torpedo attacks. We keep suffering attrition of torpedo attacks. Right, we're gonna carry on, or are they gonna go, right, and we're gonna pause, fall back, and, well, the infrastructure industry is building up more, so we might as well just wait till we've replaced our losses, and then carry on. Consolidate whatever we have gained. It's similar to the French plan. Yeah. The Jeune Ecole is about flotilla defense. First with small ships with rapid-firing shell guns, or shell guns. Then small ships with torpedoes. And then submarines with torpedoes, and torpedo boats, and all those things. And stopping the enemy from being able to blockade you, stopping the enemy fleet from being able to close your coast, stopping any amphibious operations, and preferably destroying the enemy fleet when they come to your coast. And the cruisers wandering around the world, causing maximum damage and destruction to enemy commerce and trade. The reality was different. But the thing is, what happens to a nation, and what happens when a leadership allows a theory, no matter how attractive, to take over their policy? That's what today's video is about. With that all being said, shameless book plug time. So this is the point where I tend to thank everyone for supporting and subscribing and to the channel, for super chats, super thanks, for all those things which make the channel work, because that's the point of this channel. It's me as a naval historian funding my research, funding my work, so I can carry on being a naval historian. So I can do all this stuff which you have to do as an academic anyway, but we don't get paid to do. And we don't really get supported to. And I like doing naval history where I don't have to worry about ticking grant boxes. Where I can just go and do the naval history and I can present it. And if people want to support it, they can. If people don't want to support it, then they don't have to. That's what I like. So I love doing this, and this is my current book out. I have got more coming out this year. I'm hoping one's going to be a birthday present to myself, coming out about the end of March. Hoping, but whilst I've now got the pictures and everything, I'm now editing it, and yeah, I am not going. I am a pain when it comes to editing. Okay, I will admit this. I am a pain. I am a perfectionist when it comes to editing my writing work. It's a terrible habit, and I will try to eke myself out of it. But all this is possible only thanks to your support. All this is possible, and for Patreon, a moment, the patron suggestions for March 2025. Those are the suggestions which patrons put in their ideas of what questions they'd like to see answered in the Naval History Lives in March. And then what happens is, once they've put in their suggestions, I then put those suggestions, as many of those suggestions as I can, up to a vote. And then the top 2 get made into lives, and the next 2, 3 and 4, get made into premieres by vote. So you get a lot. So the top 2 get both a live and a recorded video, and it's a lot of fun. So that's coming up. That's the suggestions for what those things to be voted on. It's currently live now on Patreon if you want to go make it. So yeah. But without much further ado, so where does the Hoche come into this? Well, the Hoche is slap bang in the middle of all this. Pretty much, timeline, event, etc., it comes right in the middle. And it's actually under construction. It's actually being worked on when Aube is Minister of the Navy and the Colonies. And you also remember that it's Minister of the Navy and the Colonies. They have both titles and both roles. And so is subject to the pause. Now, some would say she's a very good ship for all of that. That when she enters service, she's still quite a capable asset. I'm not so sure. But the reason I'm not so sure is because, honestly, her design is full of interesting issues, which have been reflected in the fact that the battleship has been quite so contentious an issue for 20 years. By the time we're talking about over 20 years. That the battleship has been subject to constant derision for that period. And whilst France has been building them, they haven't really been building them with conviction. And what I'd also say is worse, they haven't necessarily followed the design trees which are sensible. Well, rather the paths of the design trees which are sensible. We're talking about as we go on, because one of the things I find interesting is when we start to look at why do French battleships become this shape when other powers don't? Why do they start becoming raised up? Why do they start sort of growing up and sort of... They're almost a reflection of the Martian tripods from War of the Worlds. In that they're almost, we're raising up to provide better line of sight for our weapons. And you can argue that to an extent, but traditionally, what other people did was they didn't raise up the whole ship. They raised up the control positions. Now, yes, fighting ranges in this period are not that dissimilar to those of the age of, say, on the Napoleonic War, on paper, when we're discussing them. In reality, there is difference going on. We can see this in the few actions that do take their place in this era, in that the opening salvos are often from much greater ranges than they were done in the Napoleonic War era. And the accuracy they're expecting, not necessarily achieving, but the accuracy they're expecting is also different. The value of their firepower and what they're expecting it to achieve is different. It's one of those dichotomies that it's very easy to write off this period because of what comes later, because of the Dreadnought era, because of the capabilities that we see in that later period, and that's the next really sort of great period of naval technology, and this is a period of transition. It's very easy to write it off, and that happens with technological periods of transition. It's very easy to write them off and go, well, they're still using the tactics of the earlier period, and they haven't yet got the technology properly of the next period, so they aren't using those tactics. When you look at the Battle of Tsushima, and you look at tactics used there, and those don't come from a vacuum. Those tactics do not come from a vacuum. They've been being developed for a while. And often tactical and operational development goes hand in hand with technological development. It doesn't sit and wait around for the next technological generation to come through. It is actually happening. And the Jeune Ecole is a symptom of that. The Jeune Ecole itself is a symptom of the technological development taking place, because its entire basis depends on that technology. So you can't argue it isn't. Now, the thing is, you could say the counterpoint to the Jeune Ecole is the big gun fleet. You can't argue that, and the big gun fleet, and eventually what will become the Dreadnought concept. But there's a reason why HMS Dreadnought, the famous all-big gun battleship, is armed with 27 12-pounder, that's 3-inch or 76mm guns, and 5 18-inch torpedoes. Torpedoes are her last launchers. Well, the launchers anyway. She carries more than 5 torpedoes. The torpedo launchers, torpedoes, they are about her having a capability that if you do get close, if you do get really close and you're a big ship trying to close in for a kill, then she's got something nasty for you. She can still get revenge. I always think torpedo tubes on battleships, especially once you get to the point of realistically the Royal Sovereigns, in terms of the classes we're going to be talking about today, the earlier Royal Sovereigns from the 1890s, torpedoes are becoming their Avenger weapons. You have sunk everything, you have damaged everything to the point at which this ship is going down, you're closing in for the celebration, well, we're going to take you out with us. But the 3-inch guns, the 12-pounders, those guns, they are a response to the flotillas. A response to we're going to send a lot of small rapid-fire ships in to destroy you. No, we're going to carry a lot of rapid-firing guns which are going to be able to destroy the smaller ships. And as you want to make the small ships more and more survivable in the face of those weapons, they're going to grow in size. It's the joy of warfare. It always happens. You start off with something small and tiny and go, look at how powerful this is. And then you go, why does it all do that? So I'm going to have to add in a bit more power and a bit more speed. It's going to grow a bit. And the enemy's going, well, we're going to add in this system which is going to be able to take out that. Well, I wanted to be able to necessarily survive in the threat environment of that, so it's going to be faster and bigger. And it just is a never-ending cycle of it growing and growing. It starts off as a small design and grows and grows and grows. We're seeing this with drones. We're seeing this with all systems. It's what happens. And it happens because of a predictability of human nature, of response and counter-response, of we've got this new system, this is how we're going to respond to it, and how they react to it. So, with that being said, where does the disruption come in? Well, the disruption comes in once you start mucking around with the abilities to build the orders for battleships. You start to lose the capabilities to build them rather rapidly, and those are the abilities of trophy. So if you go, well, I'm not going to be ordering battleships, okay. I'm going to order cruisers though, so that's fine, I'm still ordering big ships. Well, that might keep the yards going. It's not going to keep the yards going the same way, but it's going to keep the yards going. But there are going to be things that are going to change. For starters, there's the quantity of iron and steel you're producing. A battleship is a far more dense construct than a cruiser. They might be similar size, but a battleship usually weighs a lot more, and so it takes a lot more. And armour, there's a huge difference in terms of the total amount of armour carried. Again, this is an often discussion of whether ships are battle cruisers, fast battleships, or battle cruisers, etc. People always go, well, they have the same belt. Yeah, they might have the same belt thickness. How much of the hull does that belt cover? How much subdivision is behind that belt? That'll soon tell you whether it's a battle cruiser or a fast battleship. And the thing is, whilst it reaches a peak, you can argue with the power of the Jeune Ecole doctrine when it has someone who is quite so partisan achieving its head, achieving the headship of the Navy, getting a political appointment with an abject failure of the political leaders of the country in appointing someone so partisan. It's fine to be an advocate of things. In fact, we should be advocate for things. It's always good to advocate for what you believe in. It is a good thing. But it is not good to be in a scenario where you will only accept one way and you will not listen to other scenarios. Especially when you're in charge of defense. Especially when you're in charge of education or the economy. You have to listen to the other options. And you have to give them a fair chance. Because usually there are going to be things going on where they might work. There are going to be scenarios. And you're going to have to think it through. That's the point of being a leader. This is one of the reasons why I would say it's rare you have theorists making good strategic commanders. Especially paper theorists. There's an interesting one where we're talking about Admiral Henderson and Royal Navy's build-up in the 1920s and 30s. And he's a theorist of steel. He builds what he's thinking about. So it's an interesting question as to how good a strategic commander he would have been. Seems to be fairly good. But he died before World War II, so never got those command postings, so we can't really give him a full assessment. But most of the people who are theorists in terms of papers... Well, we know Corbett never was in that position. Mahan was about an average naval officer is the best thing you can probably write about him in terms of his actual naval service. Aube here was an okay naval officer, but really not suitable for a higher command. And you can go through others and listed along like it. His halting of battleships. It's a political grandstanding, because he's not managing to cancel the battleships, he's halting their construction. Although when we talk about the cancelling, there is a possibility he does cancel some. But it's like everything in this period, it's a mess. I have a wonderful book not far away from me here, which I was reading. Yeah, there we go. Nope, don't drop. And a good example of what I'm going to discuss from this period. Now, this is about a battleship I'll be talking about in a second. It's a kind of important battleship in this period. The month in which the ship's construction began was variously reported as December 1872, January 1873, and July 1873. The last probably being her keel lading. Design of the was definitely approved on 14th of November 1873. However, in July 1875, when construction of the hull was already well advanced, the maximum belt arm was increased from 300 millimeters to 350 millimeters. And in July 1872, the council suggested using two independent engines, one to provide economical steaming at low speeds and the other to be coupled for higher speeds, a complex arrangement resembling that also used in the contemporary Duquesne and Duguay-Trouin class cruisers. After more changes, a contract was signed on the 1st of June 1874 with Creusot for compound engines consisting of three independent groups of two cylinders, each driving the single propeller shaft. It gets worse when you start to look through some of the stats for this ship, and I'll talk more about it when we get to it, but when you have books like this, written by very good historians, in the case of Stephen Roberts, a pretty darn good historian, and they can't even give you a firm date for when a battleship is starting to be constructed because of the disputes going on at the time in the higher echelons of the Navy and all the arguments going on. That tells you you've got a problem. I honestly think they would have been better selecting someone from outside the Navy to be Navy ministers in this period. These sort of debates is what gives me the one advantage for having civilians or people who have not had a service actually be in charge of armed forces, because they're not wedded to any side, and they will probably, if they are good at their jobs, listen to all sides and come to some sort of compromise where everyone will be disappointed, but not disappointed to the extent they are devastated. Because usually that's the way you achieve a balanced combined force. Everyone's disappointed. It's why I always find it funny whenever anyone focuses on centerpieces of various armed forces and go, oh no, if you hadn't built that, we could have this, this, this. And you go, well, no, that's entire structure, combined structure, is built around that centerpiece. Tanks for the army, carriers maybe for the navy, a certain type of jet for the air force. That's their centerpiece. They're building their whole structure around that. The problem comes if you don't deliver the structure, not from the centerpiece. Because there's no point having the structure and with no centerpiece, and there's no point having the centerpiece with no structure. You need to have both. You need to have a balanced, combined force. Now, the thing is, things have been going bad for a while. Whilst we could blame Aube, and we could say, you know, it's him, he causes this trouble, and this therefore leads to because of pausing construction for an entire year, that causes ripples throughout French manufacture. Let's look at the ships they were designing and what they were doing. You know, we talk about the BattleHotels sometimes as if they come from nowhere, or the Battle of Chateaux. They don't. They don't. There have been ships which have been coming on all the time. This vessel, the Corsair, launched in 1882, a Devastation-class battleship when it's originally launched. I think it's one of the ones which gets re-rated as a armoured cruiser later in its life, but look at it. It looks, honestly, it would be a great model for a steampunk design, but it doesn't look like an elegant French warship. It's not the style we would expect from a nation which produces some of the finest designs in history as well as some of the worst. They're kind of like the French Navy is kind of like Blackburn as a company, the aircraft company. They either produce something which is absolutely horrendous or something which is sublimely gorgeous. Nothing ever in between. The interesting thing with the Devastation class, though, if we continue on, is because the British also have a Devastation class. The British Devastation class, or the Royal Navy, they're their first battleships produced without sails. And then for the Royal Navy, they're the first ones produced without masts and sails. Devastation and Thunderer. They are all laid down in 1869, launched 1871 and 1872, and completed 1873. Thunderer is completed but not commissioned until 1877. She has other things going on, but they sort of keep to a rough sort of time schedule. But then we look at Devastation and Corsair for the French. They're built by the Arsenal de Lorient and the Arsenal de Toulon, rather like, again, the Devastation class for Royal Navy, built by the Portsmouth and then the Pembroke dockyard as well. So they're both built by naval dockyards. And the Devastation, well, she's laid down in 1875. She's launched in 1879. Just 4 years later. She's commissioned in 1882. So, a little under 6 years later. Well, a little under 7 years later. She starts in December 1875. So to July 1882, it's probably a little over 6 years, actually. Just a little over 6 years. Again, compare that to the Royal Navy's devastation, which is a little under 4 years. Admittedly, yes, they're the smaller, arguably slightly less complicated ship, but still, they're produced in an earlier time period. They're produced 6 years earlier? Well, no. They start being built, they're laid down 6 years earlier. They are completed 9 years earlier. And then, with the Corvair, well, she is laid down in 1875. She's launched in 1882. And they do a lot of modifications to the Corvair. They do a lot of work on her after she's finished. And she doesn't commission properly till 1886. October. Over 11 years after her construction began. 11 years. Thundra, even with the issues of not being commissioned and being built in the Pembroke Dockyard, which was the smallest, really, of the Royal Navy's naval dockyards, and in Wales, so one of the more difficult ones to actually reach, it's 8 years. The thing is, the French are in a sort of a trap, because they are trying to push the technology of their battleships, but they're also fighting on terms of the technology of should they even be building battleships? This is the trouble. The debate is, should we be building the most modern ideas of battleships, or should we be even building battleships? And one of the problems that comes about is that makes them prone to great changes and great evolutions while they're constructing the ships, which means they're always stopping, changing, and then carrying on. They're always modifying. I cannot think of a single ship of the French Navy which starts an approved design in terms of battleship, starts an approved design, and actually completes the design it was started at in this period. Can't think of a single one. Every single one gets modified along the way. Now you can say that's a good thing. They are trying to keep their ships up to date even as technology is changing around them. That is a good thing. But that also means they keep pausing construction. And it's delaying and delaying and delaying and spreading out the construction, which means it spreads out the demand for the systems, for the armour, which lowers the market even more, and lowers the industrial infrastructure even more to support it. Which leads us to the path to Hoche, which is a rather fun bit of history, and I'm going to expand it a bit so you can pause the screen if you want and read all these ships and get an idea of their history. Now, if you want the fun point, the Redoubtable. That's the one I was reading about earlier, and if I insert the name and I read the full paragraph, although the council was ready to accept this design on the 5th of November 1872, Debussy then proposed major changes to it. He felt that the 274.4mm gun would soon be regarded as insufficient, and proposed replacing the 6 274.4mm guns in this battery with 4 305mm guns of a new steel model, and the 4 240mm guns on the upper deck with 2 274.4mm guns. This would reduce axial fire from 6 to 4 guns, but enhance the ability to perforate armour. It will also allow the shortening the battery and deleting the rotating platforms on the upper deck. The single guns then being on a simpler mountings in half turrets with vertical bulkheads or parapets only on the outboard side. Using the save weight, Debussy increased the maximum thickness of the belt from 220mm to 300mm, 220mm at the end, the battery armour from 160 to 240mm, and the transverse bulkheads from 120 to 150mm. The Council proposed deleting the armour on the parapets for the 2 guns on the upper deck, leaving only fin plating. Because the steel 305mm gun had not yet been developed, it never was, the armament of this design became 4 274.4mm guns in the battery and 2 320mm, that's 19.3 M1870 guns on the upper deck, and some 138.6mm guns on the deck. Debussy's plans, dated from 22nd of October 1872, were approved by Minister Portal on the 14th of November 1872. The month in which the ship's construction began was variously reported as December 1872, January 1873, and July 1873. The last probably being her keel laying. The design of Redoubtable was definitively approved on the 14th of November 1873, after she technically had her keel laid down a few months earlier, because if you consider July 1873 her keel's laid down, steel was cut probably January 1873. So, and, you know, basically you could say, well, you know, they took they have the yard design in December 1872 in contract, so that it's a year after that pretty much they have the design definitively approved. But however, in July 1875, when construction of Hull was well advanced, I'd hope it's well advanced by this point, it's been going on for, let's be honest, 2 years at this point, the maximum belt armour was increased from 300mm to 350mm. In July 1872, the Council suggested using 2 independent engines. Now, France is not the only nation to suffer from this at this point. Lots of nations are suffering from FOMO, fear of missing out, let's be honest. But the thing is, France is the one which is probably most suffering from it. Because they keep looking at the new science and new options, at what they could do. And then it comes to the path to Hoche. Well, Redoubtable, I've just given an example of, laid down probably July 1873 is when we should go for it. And commissioned is probably February 1879. But there are debates about that. And she was launched in September 1876, so, you know, she was 5.5 years under construction. And then we had the devastation of Corbair, which have their fun times. And then we have the Admiral Dupré. And by the way, Corbair is also named for an admiral. He's an admiral who died of disease after the Sino-Franco War. Now, again, the Dupré is laid down December 1876 and commissioned 1883, so about 7 years later. Béard and Tourigny, again, they take a long time to get in service. We're talking 5-6 years. Vauban and Duscan, August to March 1877, and launched July 1882, April 1883, commissioned probably 1887, but there's a discussion about that, believe it or not. There is a discussion about that because they're completed, but are they actually in service? When are they actually commissioned? There are issues and there's things being done on them. And then we have Terrible. Now, here's the thing. The Terribles are actually a pretty good class of ships. By this point, the French have got some really interesting ideas going on in production. They appear to have standardized on the design. And you've got this coming in, which doesn't look too dissimilar to what will evolve into the Royal Sovereigns. It doesn't look too similar to the Royal Navy's Admiral class, which are sort of contemporaries. Laid down December 1877, August and November 1878, depending on which ships we're talking about. Look at when they're completed. In fact, one of the interesting things is the design is so good, they go back and repeat it. That's what happens. That's why you have that slash going through. Because they go, we've ordered 2. We'll order 2 more. That's why you have 2 laid down in 1877 and 2 laid down in 1878 next year. But look at the years it takes to complete them. The Terrabelles and Indomitable, they are completed in November, and they're commissioned in July 1886 and November 1885. We would probably expect Terrible to have been commissioned earlier in 1886, but there were issues because of Aube. Or rather, Aube. And the rest delayed till 1887, 1888 because of, again, Aube. Then we have Admiral Bourdon and Formidable. Well, yeah. They take 10 years. France have been speeding up their construction. They've been getting better. They've been getting their ships' designs tighter. They've been getting things working. They've been going in a positive direction. This is why Aube gets the stick he does, because despite the debates going on, despite the issues going on, despite the fact that some of the designs coming out were looking interesting, the French Navy was starting to get things under control. They were starting to get a rhythm of their construction going. It was going in a positive direction. Then we have what happens to the Admiral Bourdon, the Formidable, and the Hoche. Hoche takes 10 years. Not the longest on here to build, but takes 10 years. So does the Bourdon, and so does the Formidable. They take 10 years. When you consider the previous class, taken 9 years, 8 years, and classes before that had taken, they were again affected by the pause, but the classes before that had taken, again, time, but again, issues from the pause. We have to go back to the Bernard and Turin to have an idea of what they could actually achieve 5-6 years. That's the last class which was unaffected by Aube and the issues going on, and they take 5 to 6 years to build and enter service. We look at the class prior to that, and yes, technically it's December 1876 to April 1883. So technically, it is into its 7th year, but it's realistically a little over 6 years. Devastation and Corsair. Well, 7 years, and one has to go for a marathon of 11 years, but, you know, some people just like that. Sometimes they do. But again, we go back, Redoubtable, roughly 6 years. So we see what they can do when they're actually focused. The French can build a ship in 6 years. When they even when they're changing their mind going on with the Redoubtable. And with what I've just read, you cannot disagree that they were changing their ideas. They can still churn out a ship in 6 years. It's not quite what the British are achieving contemporaneously, but it's not bad. The British might be on average 4 years, the French 6 years. But the French, to an extent, are more obsessed about getting things right because the British are building more. And that pressure can add to the delays and it starts you down the road of we've got to change things, we've got to improve things. Because of their strategic situation. And then the pause goes in. The pause. Now we talked about from January 7th, 1886 to May the 30th, 1887. Pretty much for almost his entire time, battleships are paused. And you can see here all the ships affected by that. All the ships affected by it. There are a lot of them. So then we have to consider what happens after this. Is this where the French Navy start to recover themselves? And honestly, it isn't. Honestly, it isn't, because, well, look at the Brenner stat. That is down to 8 years, yes. But that's not particularly brilliant. And Marseille, Neptune, and Magenta, well, they are 9 years, 10 years, and, well, 10 years, a little over 10 years, you know, respectively. Again, they're part of the pause. We have the Charles Martel class. Planned, ordered, cancelled. Even in 1884 or 1886, there is a debate. And by the way, for some of you, there is going to be a discussion as to whether or not the Brennus is actually the second Charles Martel, just modified and improved. No. 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 I can understand why there's confusion, because the name is continued on, and I can understand where the issue might come from. But when you realise that the hull shaping and keel shaping is completely different, whilst they might well have tried to save money by taking material that was going to be used for the Brennus and using it on the Brennus, they're not the same ship. So, with the impact of this, with all these delays, all these issues affecting their construction and affecting their industry, which then has a feedback which slows their own production because it makes it harder for them to get resources. And this, as I talked about already, with Redoubtable, guns and whole systems which don't come into existence because industry doesn't have the capacity to deliver what they're asking for because of the keep stop starting and the delays and the constant changing of mines. What are the other reasons for this, other than the, you know, the Jeune Ecole and the political fights going on about that, which we'll be discussing more as we go on? Well, the first other reason I want to give you is what I usually see when I start talking about this, because people go, no, it wasn't that, it was their response to the British. Usually at some point someone goes, the Royal Sovereign class. And especially when they're looking at this thing, where the Charles Martels are cancelled, and then the Brennus is ordered. Well, the Royal Sovereigns are cool. They are a really good class. The trouble is the dates don't match up. You see, the Brennus itself is laid down in January 1889. The Royal Sovereign is laid down in September 1889. So you are potentially in a Gloire warrior scenario, I suppose, you could argue, but at this point the Royal Navy really isn't paying that much attention to French large ship construction, because they each come out so individual. It's the Royal Navy's estimation is that France can't produce a functioning, cohesive squadron, is the phrase. Which is not a demeaning or damning phrase. It's literally, these ships are individually quite might be capable, but operating them together as an effective squadron is going to be next to difficult and impossible because of their different characteristics. Which means that with our forces, if we should be able to operate in efficient squadrons, we should be able to overmatch them, even when individually, one-on-one, our ships might be not as capable. So, the Sovereign was laid down September 1889, launched February 1891, commissioned May 1892. The Brennus was ordered in 1888. Sovereign was ordered in 1889. Just to clarify that one. Brennus takes from January 1889 to January 1896 to enter service. 7 years. 7 years. 8 if you include time from ordering. Royal Sovereign takes 3. I would love to say the Jeune Ecole, well, if you look at the cruisers, the French are doing better. Their policy with cruisers, because they emphasize cruisers, is doing better. But no, they're having just as hard a time. Because the fights over armament, the fights over what is the path they should go on, is affecting everything. And you're left up with a point of, is it better to aim for the perfect ship or the ship you can have? Which works better in operational requirements? The ship that would have been perfect on paper, if you got it eventually, or the ship which was available 3 years earlier and you learnt from and then you ordered a whole other class? How was it in the time it took for the French to build the Brennus and get her into service? The Royal Navy completed the 8 Royal Sovereign members of the Royal Sovereign class. The 2 Centurion members of the Centurion class had almost got HMS Renown commissioned and were launching in 1896. And in 1890, and launched by 1896. By January 1896, it's 2, 3, 4, 5 members of the Majestic class. 5 members of the Majestic class? Out of 9? In the time it takes the French to be constructing not just the Brennus, which is a one-off, but also the Charles Martel, which is another one-off, which they start at, and it gets completed well after the British ships, 1897. The Carnot, again, is laid down 1891, originally launched in 1894, commissioned 1897. The Jungberry, all these ships that are built pretty much as one-offs, as single ship designs. All of them. The British are turning out, well, 16 ships. And cruisers. How? British industrial capacity is great, yes, at this point, and they are approaching the peak of their industrial and capability. That's going to be seen in the 1900s and into the early 1910s, vis-a-vis the rest of the world. But the French had traditionally been the second navy for a long time. They had regularly threatened Britain with its production. They have, when you look at the maths of it, they have the yards. They have the industrial potential. They have the economic potential. And the answer comes down to, it's the politics and the leadership. Because part of being a leader and a good advocate for something is also knowing when it's time to not pause something. You see, when you're an admiral, when you're a minister of marine, when you're in this kind of power, you've got to put country first and country safety and security first. If you're putting your own persuasions, your own perspectives first, in terms of your own inclinations of what you think over everything else, well, if you're right, and that is very rare you turn out to be right, you are of course called a visionary. But far more often than not, you are called tunnel visioned. And we have plenty of examples of our own time period to point to from this fact. So how has this all happened? How has this all come to this? How has the Navy become so riven by debate, so riven by factionalism over a doctrine, over a theory of war, that they're not able to produce realistically anything? That everything is subject to this constant battle of either you're for this or you're for this, and you cannot produce any compromise. It has the infrastructure impact it does. Well, I'm going to say it comes down to roughly 4 people in a period between 1883 and 1887. I'm going to put them at the fault. And that's Vice Admiral Alexander Perron, Minister of Navy and Colonies, August 1883 to April 1885. He is a perfectly nice, perfectly effective officer and administrator. He goes on to becoming a senator for life in the government. But realistically, he doesn't try and shut down the debate. In fact, in some ways, he encourages the debate. He encourages and promotes officers who are taking an active part in a hard line in the debate. Why? Because he thinks that's the way he's going to balance it. Then after him, you have Vice Admiral Charles Eugene Galabert, who is another perfectly affable personality. He's in charge from April 1885 to January 1886. And when you include a career of these 2 officers and in the posts of Minister of Navy and the Colonies, they are both very much distracted by world events, but also very much trying to let things sort itself out. Let the fire of debate sort things out. I was once told by a friend, and I will explain why I'm putting this in here, that the most important thing to get yourself invited to French dinner parties was having an opinion. If you have an opinion, doesn't matter if it's right or wrong, but if you're prepared to argue it, you're going to be interesting and entertaining at dinner parties. I don't believe this is quite correct. In my own experience dealing with French people, there are certainly some who are of that inclination, but I think more the fact that having dinner parties and that sort of events with friends is far more of a modern French thing, whereas in other cultures it necessarily hasn't survived. But the point here is if you have the right opinion in this period, you get noticed by the public. And I think with these officers, they're both going the case of we need to make the case of funding. We need to make the case for the Navy actually getting funding. And these are the naval officers who are prepared to catch on to the high-profile things and are riding it, holding on to it, guiding it in some ways, and therefore have the status themselves, have the profile themselves. You know, the issues have a profile, they have a profile themselves to try and make the case for naval funding, to try and compete on a political level. It's a situation which in many ways the French were forced into. And as time goes on, as we have Aube come in January 1886 to May 1887, then Edouard Barbet, who is a civilian. He graduated from the Naval College, but then served in the army, it seems. There's a whole debate about him. We're not getting into this in too much. Like many things at this point, it's messy. But French politics is often messy. And most nations' politics is messy. It's going to depend. What usually is the level at which it's messy at. Is what changes between nations. Is it messy at the implementation? Is it messy at the conception? Is it messy at the management? Most nations have mess in their politics somewhere. So this period from August 1883 to December 1887 is really when we see the most damage start to take place. And I'd argue the reality you can say for this, that you have all these high profiles, you have these keep swings in the construction. What happens? What is the scenario that happens? Well, the good example is Brennus herself. Okay, because after the Brennus, which is fine, single ship. Okay, the Royal Navy does that with Dreadnought as well. So you'd expect. After this, they produced a single ship. Okay, they've got a design they're to an extent happy with. Yes, it took them a little time to produce it, but okay, fine. Build more. But no, then comes the Charles Martel, which is another single ship. Then comes the Carnot, which is another single ship. Then comes the Jeribre, which is another single ship. In fact, we don't get another class of battleships from the French until we get to the Charlemagne class, which are 2 ships, well, 3 ships, actually. There's a reason I said 2. Laid down in 1894, 1895, and 1896. Now, even then, Charlemagne and St. Louis are, to an extent, more similar than Charlemagne and Gaulois, which, even though Gaulois is produced at Arsenal de Brest, the same as Charlemagne. Gaulois is laid down in 1896, and as you can imagine, with the French being the French at this point in their productivity, having a ship named down in 1894, 1895, and as the next one, 1896, they have evolutions, they have differences going on, they have modifications. It's not massive, but it's enough that I, to an extent, consider the Gaulois a bit of a one-off. And then they go back to single ships, right up until you get to the Republic, and are still pre-dreadnoughts, and they're being built. They take 6 years to get into service. They're starting to get back into. It takes them pretty much until you get to the Republiques for them to start to get to what I would consider a consistent build profile and actually starting to keep to their designs. And it's after they had the Republics, then they have classes. They had the Dantons, the they had Libertés, the Dantons, the Corberts, and then eventually, of course, the Bretagnes. And they actually have classes again. And I would say proper classes, in that they're being conceived and built at similar times. They're being built over very similar designs. They actually can work together as a concerted force. And the reality is all that was caused by the fractures and disruptions of industry, but also the disruptions of their procurement process, caused by the Battle of the Jeune Ecole. The politics of it, the fighting of it, the extremism of it. It's one of those fun things today. Most ideas, most theories, most doctrines, most political perspectives mostly are useful in moderation. They have a value in moderation. And please note I'm saying most here. Most is doing a lot of work. For someone else says, well, that means you like this extreme ideology is useful in some ways. Not saying that. But usually the extreme ideas and extremist political views and extremist doctrines, etc., they come from a starting point which is a good idea. But that's been evolved and evolved and evolved and evolved and evolved until it's now an all or nothing, and that's when it's bad. Taking pride in your country is a good thing, I would argue. It's good to value your country. It's good to, it's good to want to better your country, to improve it for the people who live there, to improve it, to make it, to get its history learnt, to basically promote your country. Those are good things, I would argue. But if you take to the point at which it's your nation is above all others and everyone else is below you and should be, therefore are not worthy of life because they're not your nation, that's bad. Now, both those definitions can fit underneath the House of Nationalism. One, I would argue, is the moderate position. It's a good thing. Nationalism in moderation. It's the positives of it. You want to do something better. You want to make things better. You think your country is good. You like your country. You want to make it better. That's a good thing. The other end of the spectrum, where it's your country is above all others, is bad. Because it also means you can't learn lessons from others when they're doing things well, or even really learn lessons from them when they're doing things badly. Because the reason it's going bad for them must be because it's them. You would do it better. And if they're doing it well, you automatically don't need to learn from them because you would do it better. That's the problem when you have that perspective. You can't learn anything. And I can do it for other sides as well. But that's just a relatively easy one to do. And fits quite well with the discussions going on at this point, because here the debate between the Jeune Ecole and everything around it was about national security, was about the safety of France, what was the best policy to preserve not just the French state, but the French position in the world. And as such, it's a very high-stakes debate. People get very involved in it. And it's made worse by the conflicts they find themselves fighting in. And the reality is, the more hard-line those debates go, the more fractions you get between different sides, the less they could cooperate, the more you start having these things being portrayed as if they're standalone assets. And they're not. See, what's the best way, realistically, to draw an enemy battle fleet into an area? Probably your own battle fleet. The thing that's going to contest to control the sea. So if you really think that you can beat the enemy battle fleet with your torpedo boats, with your small ships, that's great. But you want to make sure the enemy battle fleet is concentrated to come in to engage those things so you can achieve the maximum effect. So you should be building a battle fleet anyway to draw them in. Enough ships that they have to come fight you. They have to come. They can't just stay away. They can't just do a distant blockade on you. And again, we can say, well, distant blockade, that's a concept of World War I, is it? No, it's not. Distant blockade has been around for as long as close blockade has been. It's called various different things, including guerre de course. But basically, distant blockade is economic warfare. It's blocking the trade, disrupting the trade, getting to a nation without doing a blockade of their individual ports. So it's usually blockade as applied to trade routes. And if you're really aiming this against Britain, which has the world's largest empire and the world's the most numerous bases along those trade routes, they can implement distant blockade fairly easily on you. They can break up your empire, if you're the French, fairly easily because of where their ships are, where their positions are. So you need to make sure their battle fleet is going to come to you if you're going to win this fight. If you're going to make sure that your cruisers are able to do their job. So you need those battleships. So arguably, if you want to do a successful Jeune Ecole, you should have been arguing for battleships as well. But they weren't. Because that would have represented a softening of the position. That would have looked like weakness, accommodation. So with that being said, I do not want to finish this without giving a little call out to a historian here called Dr. Theodore Ropp. He was a man who advised Admiral King. Ernest King was his historian and the one who talked to him most on those things. And he also kicked off a lot of the modern study of the Jeune Ecole. War in the Modern World, I think, is the modern publishing of his book, and you can find copies of it. It has been reprinted at various points. He's dead now, but it's a very, very interesting read. It's a very interesting work. Again, some of the modern scholarship would disagree with what he said, and that scholarship is based on sources which have been discovered since he died, and since that work was published. Does that mean you shouldn't go read his book? Not to me. Because the thing is, as long as you bear in mind his analysis reflects what he knew, what was known and available at the time, you can learn a lot from the analysis. You can learn a lot from the history of the history. Because that analysis, that history, then shapes the generation of historians who came after him, the generation of historians who came after them, and has shaped quite a lot of the modern discussion of these things. When it comes to the Jeune Ecole, Theodore Ropp is probably the biggest reason why it's as much a part of the modern conversation as it is. That it hasn't disappeared like some of the other doctrines have. Well, let me rephrase that correctly. The other doctrines haven't disappeared. They've just been folded seamlessly into the new terminology for those doctrines, like targeted fires and long-range fires and all these things. And you sort of go back, hang on, that long-range fire control and all these things have been part of doctrine development since about the 1830s. 1820s. It's been sort of enunciated as a doctrine. It just keeps changing its name every few years. Okay, but Jeune Ecole has survived, and I would argue in part it survived because of the work of Theodore Ropp, and him using it as an example of, this was a good idea. But it's a good idea poorly executed without considering what else is going on outside the fishbowl. And without noticing that the Navy you're theoretically targeting has gone, we like that idea, but if we couple that idea with a massive fleet, and this is why when you go into World War I, the Royal Navy and the French Navy are the world's two leading naval submarine powers in terms of number of submarines available. If we couple this with a whole fleet and we have the whole thing built up, we have a balanced force. You know, flotillas make a great... This was the other thing I realized. Well, let's say you do down the flotilla defense route, as I pointed out. What happens if your enemy does as well? And now you've got two flotillas both waiting for the other to come and engage it? At which point, the British will probably have flotillas all around the world, because again, they're getting invested in far more money in Navy than the French can, because they don't have all land borders to defend in Europe. That's going to cause your cruisers trouble. There are issues with the Jeune Ecole. So, here you go. How did the Jeune Ecole produce these? I've got the Marceau and the Carnot up there. The Marceau, of course, was the leadership of a two-ship class, and then we've got the Carnot, which is launched in 1894, and this is her drawn in 1896. How does it produce such hotels? The scenario you have going on here is that the battleship designs have been constantly impacted by the Jeune Ecole. They're being paused by it, designed in response to it, evolved with it as the primary threat or as the primary motivator where they really don't matter. Some points they're perceived as the status unit, at other points they're perceived as vestigial arteries. Not even vestigial organs, vestigial arteries. They're nothing. And the trouble is, battleships are, and always have been, capital assets. They've always been assets which are supreme embodiments of the nation's status and thought, like aircraft carriers today as well, and some of the larger escorts. They are the ships that most represent their nation, what it is, what it stands for, what its thought process is. And when you start to see things like this, of power diverging dramatically from others, that shows their thoughts diverging dramatically from others. But when it's starting to make less and less sense, and you're looking at them and you're going, really? How does this fit with what you want to do? How does building multiple individual assets fit with being a great power, with the status you're achieving? You want to be the second rank naval power in the world. You'd like to be the first. How are you going to achieve this way? France is muddled. France is in a strategic situation where they either cut their empire, cut their navy, and it's always interesting that the Minister of Navy is the Minister of Navy and Colonies, or they invest. But any money they invest in their navy is money they can't invest in their army, and they have got those land borders. They have got those very large land borders. They have got all those powers around them. And that makes life difficult. So realistically, you have this construction going up. You have these ships raising up in size, in scale, becoming bigger and bigger, higher and higher, in contrast to other nations' vessels, because of the reality of what they're facing, of what they're being imagined up against. Because one of the other interesting things is, if you're going to take on a battleship versus battleship conflict, there's a reason the Monitor comes into existence. There's a reason those vessels sort of become attractive for quite a while, because if you're engaging a battleship in a battleship fight, at the ranges you're likely to do so, you don't want to be a big, massive target. Anything you do to reduce the target, to make it more difficult for your enemy to focus on you, is going to give you an advantage. This design, these hotel structures, these raising things up, they're advantages if, in many ways, if you're going to be fighting flotillas. If you're going to be fighting smaller ships, large numbers of them. Because you can fire down at them, you can engage them from that much further away, because you can see them that much further away, because the horizon, the curvature of the Earth, you're able to see just that much further. But realistically, this is the product of an unbalanced fleet. And it's just something which got worse and worse. The Hoche, with its time delays and all the other problems that go into its construction, because of the debates going on, that's the timeline, that's the single point which we can fix around. But the ships after it, France ends up building single ship classes from pretty much then on. They have, after the Marceau class, which comes after Hoche, pretty much every vessel for years is a single ship class. And whilst they have some commonality, whilst they have some overlap, they're sufficiently different, every single ship of those, to make the operation of a battle fleet incredibly difficult to achieve. Possibly would have been achievable with a lot more money and practice, and money's being spent on exercising, but yeah, they never got that much budget. So what's today's question? Well, we talk a lot about Jeune Ecole, but I want you to think about other times where, especially since about the 1800s, where technology, the idea of a new technology coming in, has caused people to make bad decisions, create unbalanced forces, put themselves into difficulty. It's not just governments, it's also companies which do this. You can all name the companies which went bankrupt, banking on a new technology being their saving grace. A new system being, this is gonna turn us around. We're putting everything on red. And realistically, that's a gamble, and if it pays off, more to you. You succeeded, but please always remember that is a gamble. Could quite easily have been black, and you could have lost everything. And you can go, well, I've done my analysis, I've done this, and I've done that, and that's all good, and it's worthwhile doing it. But betting the whole house on one project, that's never sensible. That's never a good place to be. With that being said, what's coming up next week? Next week we have Togo Hachiro, and we're going to be looking at the Japanese Navy in this time period. And Togo was part of that, of course, massively part of that. And they specifically did eschew the idea of the Jeune Ecole. They went for a balanced fleet the whole way through. Small, but balanced in this period. Partially because of Togo Hachiro, but others as well, arguing it because they didn't want to find themselves in a situation where they were not balanced. Thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed, and take care.